Hi, you're here with Michael Steenkamp. I'm one of the audit directors with RSM South Africa. And today we're just going to chat briefly about some of the risks and the problems that we face and the common mistakes that we face in valuing of properties in South Africa. And really just to discuss those and why those happen. You know, property valuations are far from a scientific method or scientific process, and with that comes a lot of tendencies and subjectivity, which result in errors or overestimations of property valuations and mistakes that creep in. So, you know, this is not just a specific problem to property valuations, but also to fair valuing in the general accounting terms as well. I know the accounting standards and the accounting industry, they've been speaking for many, many years on what is fair value, and we're moving more to recognizing assets at fair value. And I know the standards define fair value as there being a willing buyer and a willing seller, and what each one would be willing to pay or sell the property or sell an asset for. But that's easy when something is for sale, but when it comes to an asset in the accounting records that's not for sale, you know, there comes a lot of subjectivity and a lot of bias in valuing of that asset. So, but the discussion today is going to be specifically on property valuations and the mistakes that are made and are commonly found in property valuations that we look at. The first common mistake we're going to look at is bias and conflict of interest. Often bias would creep into a valuation when you know, there aren't really any scientific methods or processes to follow in valuing of a property. We often find that should a property be valued by different valuers, you know, they will often get to a different result, and there's often pressures put on valuers by the company or the entity or the person they're doing the value for to overstate that for some reason or whatever, and they are then, you know, under that whole conflict of interest umbrella in when preparing those valuations and performing those valuations. And often, like we mentioned in the introduction, without a scientific method in valuing property that's available, that often those biases and conflicts of interest would come in, and those would then affect the property valuations. Another common error in property valuations is the availability of data and the availability of quality data. This is often the case in developing economies and developing countries. Take, for example, if you had to build a shopping center, or there was a shopping center in a rural area, how do you value that property accurately when there's no other comparable properties in that area? So it is important that you know, when a valuation is being done, that a detailed study gets done, taking into account the local economy in which it's in, the population, the demographics, etc. And when there is no comparable data, how does one go about properly detailing valuing that property? It is always easier to value a property in developed countries when there is a large amount of data available and comparability, and the availability of data is easily accessible. Another important mistake that often comes in is that of market volatility and what's happening in the economic market around us, that being a change in demand, interest rates, anything like that. A perfect example in recent times is that of COVID-19, where all of a sudden we had lockdown and the demand for property, and specifically commercial property, went down significantly. I know in Johannesburg in 2023, occupancy rates, you know, surged to 25% in some areas, and it was quite severe on the valuing of properties and the property valuations during that time. So it is very important when valuing properties that we're keeping an eye on what the current market conditions are, how those are changing, what the political environment is, be there elections in a specific year. So these are very, very important to take those into account. Another one is the method that is used to value properties that differs quite significantly. It could differ quite significantly. There are some common ways of valuing property, and some of those could be the market approach, where you're comparing property to other property listed in the market already in a specific area. Or if you look at the income approach, and that's when you use the rentals that are generated by the property in valuing the property. Or the cost approach, which is what would be to build the property as opposed to buying it, being all conditions the same. So those three different valuation techniques and methods could give you vastly different results and have vastly different outcomes, and are all subject to quite a lot of subjectivity in getting to those different valuations. Another one that we see, which is a common mistake in valuing properties, is the inadequacy of the regulatory environment. Weak implementation of standard or weak regulation often results in inconsistencies and inaccuracies in valuing of properties. We see that specifically in emerging markets where the regulation is quite low or quite weak. And when you have those weaknesses and those inconsistencies, it opens the property valuations to bias and human error. Another common mistake in valuing properties is the lack of transparency. So often the assumptions or any adjustments are undisclosed in a property valuation, really question the credibility of that property valuation. And when those are present, for the potential buyer, it makes them difficult to be able to assess the effectiveness of that valuation and whether or not there's anything that they do not know about in the property valuation. So often that lack of transparency creeps in when there is something that is being undisclosed. Another common mistake that we do find is that of non-standardized practices. So often, because there is a lack of standardization across property valuations, that could lead to different valuers using different valuation methods in determining the value of the property, and sometimes they might not use a methodology that is appropriate to the circumstance when valuing a specific property. This then leads to obviously the level of the competencies of the valuer, and in particular when there is inefficient training or not the right expertise available in the market. This often leads to mistakes and errors in property valuation, and this we see particularly in South Africa, where this is the case, where unexperienced or unqualified rather valuers are being employed into the market. Another common mistake we find is the ethical concerns. This is where a particular valuer or a particular real estate agent might want to talk up the positives of a property and misrepresent the characteristics of a property perhaps, and hide the negatives that go along with that property that is being looked at. Obviously, if they are a commission based on the selling price of the property, they'll always try hide the negatives and talk up the positives. So that is often a concern when valuing a property. The job of a valuer is to give and disclose the fair value of the property, and not to take into account all positives and negatives, and not hide anything from the buyer. Then lastly, some mistakes we need to look at are the external factors that might be impacting the property valuation, and that might be something like political unrest, social unrest, the supply of water and electricity in an area. All those things would affect the property valuation, and those are often overlooked and not taken into account. Specifically, you've seen in recent times the lack of supply of water or electricity in a specific area, forcing companies to move their properties to areas where the municipality's supply is more stable, and that then takes a big effect and it has a big impact on the property valuation. So that comes to the end of the list of some common mistakes in property valuations. This is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just some that we're highlighting as being the main risks and the main mistakes that we made. If you would like to read the article that this video is based on, please follow the link below the video. Or else my contact details are also shared, so please feel free to contact me. I am the head of real estate for RSM South Africa, so hopefully if there's any questions that you might have, I'll be able to help you. Thank you again for watching and for joining us. Goodbye.